American Revolution happened a really long time ago. White folks aren't over that one yet. So it seems to me we ought to at least understand history does matter, and it continues into the present.
Okay, I know that this is your life's work, but I want to get through this. I only have a certain amount of time. I don't want to get through all 5 of them. You said, assume that people know their own lives better than you do. In other words, black folks aren't crazy when they say they get profiled. I had that argument, I'm sure you remember, with a conservative radio host recently. Go ahead.
Absolutely. That one's self-explanatory, right?
Okay. All right, good. All right, stop saying you have a black friend as a get-out-of-racism-free card.
Right. I mean, the reality is, first of all, we say that we're oftentimes lying. We don't really. But more importantly, even if we have people of color in our lives, that would be like a straight man saying that he can't be sexist because he has a wife. Like, who would make that argument, right? Just because you have people who are close to you in a marginalized group doesn't mean that you don't carry any prejudice in the larger society. So that's not a get-out-of-racism-free card, and that's just not a legitimate response to the claim of racial bias.
Confront the long legacy of white denial when it comes to racism.
Yeah, this is a really big one. You know, the reality is, I understand why white folks in 2013 might not see the problem, but what's really scary is that if you go back to 1962-63, when we were still an apartheid country, before civil rights laws had even been passed, between 2/3 and 90% of white Americans in Gallup polls at that time said that they thought black folks still had equal treatment in housing, employment, and schools. So I guess my challenge to white folks is, what does it say that even when racism was blatant, we didn't see the problem? And what does that mean for us now? If we didn't see it when it was blatant and we were wrong, and black and brown folks saw it and they were right, what makes us think that suddenly we've become really perceptive and they've lost their minds? That seems totally irrational to me.
Mm-hmm. Stop using statistics incorrectly to justify prejudice. And I think that one of those is talking about crime. We don't say white on white crime, but we say black on black crime. And then when you actually look at overall violent crime in the U.S. is coming down. It's still a crisis, especially in minority communities. It's still a crisis. People are still killing each other. But you said stop using statistics incorrectly.
What I mean by that is this, you know, people have tried to rationalize racial profiling and stop and frisk in New York, for instance, by talking about the disproportionate crime rate in black communities. But the reality is that data cannot be used to justify general suspicion of all black folks. In New York, for instance, out of the millions of stops that have been made, less than 5% of the time is even a citation given, let alone an arrest. Less than 2% do they find drugs. Less than 0.2% do they find weapons. So the reality that there's disproportionate crime in a certain community cannot be used to justify the kind of overgeneralization that racial profiling and stop and frisk have brought about in places like New York and around the country.
Mm-hmm. It was hard for you to cut it down to 5, wasn't it?
Yeah, I had like 80.
And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Tim Wise, just putting some things in perspective. We're now going to go to Democracy Now! And it was a discussion on policing in the wake of Michael Brown and Eric Garner details. As you know, we had Amy Goodman speak here at Columbia High School just a few weeks ago, and she is one of the individuals on Democracy Now! So let's go and hear what this discussion was on a discussion of policing in the wake of Michael Brown and Eric Garner deaths. Let's take a listen.
Franklin here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guests are Harry Shapiro from the New York Daily News, Harry Siegel from the New York Daily News, Michael Denzel Smith from The Nation, and Graham Weatherspoon, retired detective with the New York City Police Department. Juan?
Well, Graham, I'd like to ask you about the video we've just been talking about in the previous segment. You've looked at that carefully, the video of the last moments of Eric Garner's life.
Yes, I looked at it a number of months ago. As a matter of fact, a group of us met with the Inspector General of NYPD and the newly appointed Commissioner of the Department of Investigations back in the summer. In that video, as Eric Garner is laying on the gurney, you do not see his chest rising or falling. There is no apparent movement in his body whatsoever. He's a large guy. And if he were taking a breath, or if he had difficulty breathing, it would be quite obvious. His body lays there motionless. The EMTs arrive. First of all, the police officers are to, number one, attempt to give some type of first aid to him. Allegedly, there's a pulse, they say, but you don't see this large man's body moving at all in the video. They made no attempt to open an airway. She just talks to him casually. And this is another problem because many of the EMTs and the police officers, they work together. Had not, there's a state law which requires medical personnel to report the abuse of a prisoner. It was done in the case of Abner Louima. It was a nurse that reported the physical violation of Abner Louima. And many times, the police...
Abner Louima is the Haitian immigrant who was sodomized by police.
Right.
And when he came to the hospital and was bleeding, it was the nurse.
It was the nurse that reported it. Many times, people wind up in the hospital, medical personnel who are required by law to report the abuse of a prisoner do not report it. So they too are complicitous in this whole system. It's not just the criminal justice system, it's the entire system. So the EMTs, the physicians, it runs a gamut. There's a plethora of incestuous relationships here where everybody is covering for everybody else. That shooting, I'll be at the funeral tonight for the young man Gurney, but no police officer is trained to walk on patrol with a gun in his hand. That's as reckless as giving a drunk a gun and telling him to go down the street. You do not move around with a weapon in your hand. There's no there's no emergency condition. You do not walk with a gun. You do not run with a gun in your hand. For that simple reason, and they were never trained to do it, it is not a discretionary move on the officer's part. If you are afraid, stay home with mommy. This is not a job that you can just jump into. If you are not prepared to do it, and I've spoken with rookies in the past, I said, it is okay if you feel that you're afraid. If you're afraid, you need to seek out some other type of work. This is not a casual job because you're going to wind up hurting somebody or yourself. And here it is, it's called a tragedy. This is recklessness.
You talk about all the people who are responsible, but what about all of those cops? We now know about Daniel Pantaleo. Quite astounding that the head of the PBA, the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, is talking about him as a model cop when, among other things, you've got the lawsuits and settlements from 2013. You've got the image of him with that chokehold. But the other officers, some were granted immunity. I don't know if they will be fired in this police investigation that begins today by the police commissioner.
It's acting in concert. You will find that, for instance, in Ferguson, they showed the video of Michael Brown going in and stealing some cigars. And he hands some to his friend, and his friend puts them back on the counter, and they leave the store. That went from a larceny to a robbery, technically. It was a robbery. Forcibly taking, the man tried to retrieve it. Brown pushed him, and the two went out the door. Now, the other fellow who was with Brown could be charged with acting in concert because he came with Michael Brown. The crime was committed. He didn't do anything to try and stop Michael from doing what he was doing, and he left with Michael. Here are police officers acting in concert in taking down a large man who was not in distress because of his weight or diabetes, or he only fell into distress when they jumped on him. At some point, one of the officers should say, hey, wait, hold it. Because now you're going from a lawful act to a criminal act. When a person is begging for air and you show a depraved indifference to human life, that is a crime. Representative King said recently that it's not a crime to choke. It is a felony crime to choke a person in the state of New York. He has a law degree, and he's speaking errantly. It is a felony crime to choke, cut off the airway or the flow of blood to the brain, and render an individual unconscious. It is a felony crime.
Michael Smith, I'd like to bring you into the discussion. You just wrote a piece saying that the system cannot be reformed. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, because what we're talking about here is the disposability of black life. We're dancing around it, but the reason that Eric Garner lay there and no one helped him is this is a large black man. The reason Michael Brown's body laid in the street for 4.5 hours is because this is a black man. The reason that the police show up on the scene and shoot Tamir Rice when he's holding a toy gun in Cleveland is because he's a black boy. Like, we're talking about the fact that, you have a racist and unjust system. You have racist and unjust laws. Your law enforcement then has no choice but to be racist and unjust. That's built into the fabric of what the police do. So if we're actually talking about, if we're not just talking about accountability after the fact, if we're talking about preventing these deaths from the very beginning, it's not about training the police officers not to carry their gun while they're patrolling inside of the public housing. It's about why are they in the public housing buildings in the first place. It's about this perceived threat of blackness. It's about undoing all of that and asking ourselves why we become so reliant on police in the first place to respond to things that are so minor. I mean, the police are harassing Eric Garner for untaxed cigarettes.
In fact, at that point, it has been argued that he wasn't even selling what they call these loosies.
I don't have
In fact, he had just broken up a fight of others. He had gone in to mediate that, and the police came to that. They did not see him doing that at that point.
He sold cigarettes by the Staten Island Ferry. If you talk to anyone from that part of Staten Island, he's a well-known guy. That wasn't where he was. These cops recognized him. There'd been pressure on that exact thing for a variety of other reasons, and they're just like, "Oh, this is a skeleton. This is not a person." Is that at least in some part because he was black? I don't doubt it for a second, especially in Staten Island.
Well, let's go back.
Police are in housing projects because crime there has been up, like real and serious crime. And if you go into any housing project and you talk to people there, they'll talk a lot about bad policing, but they'll also say that they want good police in there. They like the lights to work and they like to be safe.
And this is the thing, though. We foment social decay and then say, police, go fix it. This is the problem here. We are over reliant on the police, and I understand the sentiment of people living in the housing projects. I mean, I've talked to kids who have watched their friends die and be like, well, the police aren't doing anything, and it feels like they're leaving it up to us to get street justice, right? So that then leads to retaliation, more murder. So it would be nice if the police were solving these homicides in these black communities. But if we're directing so much energy to patrolling, to little things that like loitering, like public drunkenness, so-called quality of life things, then we're directing resources away from those very serious things that people actually have complaints about, and trying to fix real social ills with the police instead of investment in communities.
And Greg, the amazing thing about all this is that this is not a new story. We just had in today's New York Times, Eric Adams, the borough president of the Bronx, a former police captain, tells an amazing story about when he was a teenager and he was picked up by the police and beaten mercilessly by a group of cops in a precinct, and when he was 15 years old, and now he's the borough president of the Bronx.
Right. I was struck in the head when I was about 7 or 8 years old by a cop in the 75th precinct, going to see a show with Danny Kaye, who grew up around the corner from where I lived. The knot is still on my head. I took the job because I didn't want somebody like the cop that hit me to get that position. And we're talking about race, and we talked about it yesterday. When I was applying for the job, in 1974, a physician examined me, and as he checked me and palpated, he says, "I'm sorry, Mr. Weatherspoon, you have a heart murmur." I was a competitive athlete. I could run 10 miles in an hour. If I had had a heart murmur, I'd have been dead long before I could have seen him. So I asked him some medical terms, using medical terminology. And he said, "Well, how do you know about that?" I said, "Well, I went to school, and you went to school." Suddenly, he's like Oral Roberts. Oh, well, forget about it. Don't worry about it. Go get your ears checked. So what they do, they tell black people, they tell black men they have heart murmurs. They will have a cop come in while you're doing your